If you want to pass my subject, you must do exactly what I tell you to do." Those were the words that changed Grace's life forever. Grace was a brilliant girl. From a young age, her parents always told her, "Education is your only way out." They had no riches, no powerful connections, just hope. And that hope rested on Grace's shoulders. She worked hard, determined to make her parents proud. But there was one subject that stood between her and success: mathematics. No matter how much she studied, the numbers never seemed to make sense. Her classmates whispered about the only way to pass math. "If you want to pass, go and see Mr. Diamond. Just be ready for what comes with it." At first, Grace ignored them. She believed in hard work. She believed in fairness. But everything changed when the test results came out. The class was silent as Mr. Diamond handed out the math papers. Some students smiled. Others sighed in relief. But when Grace looked at her script, her heart stopped. 22 per 100. Her hands shook. Her throat went dry. This couldn't be happening. She had studied all night. She had solved every past question. She had prayed. "No, no, no," she whispered. Mr. Diamond smirked as he passed by her desk. He leaned down and whispered in her ear, "Meet me after school if you want to fix this." Grace felt a chill run down her spine. The school was almost empty when Grace walked into Mr. Diamond's office. Her heart pounded. She was nervous, but also desperate. He smiled. "Grace, you're a smart girl, but in life, smart people know when to make the right decisions." She swallowed hard. "Sir, I don't understand what went wrong. I studied so hard. I can do better next time, I promise." Mr. Diamond chuckled. "Next time?" He leaned back in his chair. "You think hard work will save you? This is your final year, Grace. You don't have time for next time." She nodded. "Then, what do I do?" His smile widened. "Do what I tell you to do." Silence. Grace suddenly felt the air grow heavy. She shifted in her seat. "Sir, I don't understand." Mr. Diamond stood up and walked towards her. "Don't pretend to be naive. You want to pass, don't you?" "Yes, but—" "Then do what I tell you to do." The way he said it sent chills down her spine. She grabbed her bag and rushed to the door, but he blocked her way. "You're making a mistake, Grace." She didn't care. She ran out, but her nightmare was just beginning. The next day, Mr. Diamond entered the class with a different kind of smile. The smile of a man who knew he had power. "Class, I have marked the test results, but before I continue, I want to address one thing." Everyone sat up. His eyes landed on Grace. "Some students believe they can pass my subject without showing respect. But let me be clear, those who fail to listen will face the consequences." Grace's heart pounded. He was talking about her. And it only got worse. Every question she answered in class, wrong. Every time she submitted an assignment, 0. Her friends began to avoid her. Her parents, disappointed. "Grace, how can you be failing math? Are you not studying? Do you want to waste all our sacrifices?" Her mother's voice was filled with pain. Grace locked herself in her room and cried. She had two options: go back to Mr. Diamond, fail and disappoint her family. She felt trapped until one day she saw something that changed everything. It was lunchtime. Grace was walking past Mr. Diamond's office when she heard soft crying. She paused. "Sir, please, I can't do this." It was a girl's voice, a familiar voice, Amina. Grace's stomach twisted. She peeked through the slightly open door and saw Amina wiping tears from her face while Mr. Diamond smirked. It wasn't just her. There were others. Grace gasped and quickly walked away. How many girls had he done this to? That night, she made her decision. The next morning, Grace found Amina behind the school building, sitting alone. "Amina, Did Mr. Diamond? Amina's eyes widened. No, don't talk about it. Please. Grace grabbed her hand. You're not alone. He tried it with me, too. Amina looked down. But what can we do? He's powerful. No one will believe us. Grace clenched her fists. We have to try. Since the day Grace and Amina received their report cards, their world had never been the same. Mathematics, 12 100ths. Mathematics, 9 100ths. Their hands shook as they stared at the numbers. Their hearts pounded. They had studied hard. They had answered every question correctly. They had spent sleepless nights preparing. Yet they failed. Meanwhile, the boys who barely paid attention in class, the ones who copied from each other during the exam, most of them passed, some with flying colors. Something was wrong. Amina's hands trembled as she whispered, He's punishing us because we refused to do what he wanted. Grace clenched her fists. Her whole body was shaking with anger. This man thinks he can get away with this? We need to stop him. That night, they met in secret with 3 other girls, Sophia, Linda, and Esther. One by one, they spoke. One by one, they told their stories. One by one, they cried. They had all failed, and they all knew why. Mr. Desmond, he had been doing this for years, failing girls who refused to give in to his disgusting demands. Linda's voice was cold and sharp. We have to expose him. Amina hesitated. How? Who will believe us? Grace's eyes darkened. We set him up. We get proof. We make sure he never does this again. The room fell silent. Then one by one, they nodded. The trap was set. The next morning, Grace knocked on Mr. Desmond's office door. He smirked when he saw her. So you finally changed your mind? She forced a small, nervous smile. Yes, sir, but I want to be sure. If I do what you say, will you really change my grade? Mr. Desmond chuckled, his eyes filled with satisfaction. Not just your grade. I'll make sure you pass with flying colors. Grace forced herself to smile back. Her phone was recording every word. They finally had proof, but it wasn't enough. They needed to catch him red-handed. The girls rushed to the principal's office and played the recordings. Mrs. Johnson, the principal, listened in shock. Her hands trembled as she placed them on her desk. This is unbelievable, she whispered. Then her expression hardened. We have to stop him, but we need more evidence. The girls exchanged nervous glances. How? Amina asked cautiously. Mrs. Johnson leaned forward, her eyes burning with determination. Grace, you will go to his office again. Pretend you're ready to do whatever he wants. Let him undress first. Grace's heart pounded. And then? Mrs. Johnson's voice was cold. Then we catch him. That afternoon, Grace knocked on Mr. Desmond's office door again. He smirked. So, you finally made up your mind? Grace forced a small smile. Yes, sir. Mr. Desmond stood up and locked the door behind her. Good girl, now let's begin. Grace swallowed hard. Her palms were sweaty. Sir, I feel shy. Can you go first? He chuckled. Smart girl, you don't have to be shy. Let me make you comfortable. And with that, he began removing his clothes. Grace's heart pounded wildly. Just a little more, just a little more. Outside the office, the principal and teachers stood, waiting. They had security with them. They had cameras. They had everything they needed. As soon as they heard movement inside, Mrs. Johnson nodded. Now. She kicked the door open with full force. Mr. Desmond, she roared. Mr. Desmond froze. His shirt was halfway down. His belt was undone. His eyes widened in horror. The principal, teachers, security, and some students stared at him. He was finished. Mrs. Johnson pointed at him. You are disgraced. Mr. Desmond was dragged out of his office, half-dressed, humiliated. begging. Students screamed and laughed. Phones came out, cameras flashed. The school security held him tightly as the police arrived. His wife came rushing to the scene. The moment she saw him, she collapsed in tears. "You have disgraced me. You have disgraced our family," she wailed, her voice filled with agony. Meanwhile, the videos flooded social media. Exposed. Teacher caught harassing students. Pervert teacher finally caught red-handed. Everywhere, people were talking about him. Mr. Desmond fell to his knees as the police grabbed his arms. "Please, please, don't do this to me. I was tempted, please." But nobody listened. His career was over. His reputation was destroyed. And the girls? They finally got justice. Since that day, everything changed. Male teachers became extremely careful around students. None of them wanted to end up like Mr. Desmond, disgraced, arrested, and humiliated. The principal, Mrs. Johnson, became stricter than ever. She introduced a new rule. No female student was allowed to enter a male teacher's office alone. If a girl needed to see a male teacher, she had to go with another teacher or a group of students. Whispers spread across the school. Some teachers grumbled about the new rule, but nobody dared to challenge it. Mr. Desmond's case had sent a strong message. Justice had been served. And Grace, she walked through the school halls with her head held high, knowing she had done the right thing. Her parents were now proud of her. Grace walked across the graduation stage, her heart swelling with pride as she received her certificate. She had graduated with distinction. The applause from the audience was deafening, and when she looked into the crowd, she saw her parents beaming with joy. Tears welled up in her mother's eyes. "That's my daughter," she whispered, holding her husband's hand tightly. Her father nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "She fought for justice. She didn't just survive, she won." Nina, Sophia, Linda, and Esther stood beside Grace, also graduating with high honors. They had fought together, and now they were celebrating together. As they threw their graduation caps into the air, Grace smiled. She had faced betrayal. She had faced injustice, but in the end, she had won, and she would never forget the price of that victory.